Well, my memory is one of the reasons for studying the book in the future was that I'm now 40, so I was born in the early '60s, and to an extent, I think my generation tends to think of itself as children still, and as people with parents, and I remember wanting to do something about what would be the situation of our children, kind of the next generation.
And this childlike thing has this also something. There's one story in interviews with hideous men where the depressed person is always talking about the wounded inner child. Is that something that belongs together, or is this?
Language like that, the wounded inner child, the inner pain, is part of a kind of pop psychological movement in the United States that is a sort of popular Freudianism that has its own paradox, which is that the more we're taught to list and resent the things of which we were deprived as children, the more we live in that anger and frustration, and the more we remain children. I mean, that's a very simple way of putting it, but I think the character in that story is sort of a compendium of kind of all the worst and most painful features of the popular psychology movement in the U.S. And I don't know whether there's any analog to that in Western Europe or not.
No, I think there is actually.
To the extent that I understand it, being what you call grown up isn't a lot of fun a lot of the time. There are things you have to do. There are things you want to do that you can't do for a variety of reasons. And I think I think for young people in America, there are very mixed messages from the culture. That there's a streak of moralism in American life that extols the virtues of being grown up and having a family and being a responsible citizen. But there's also the sense of do what you want, gratify your appetites, because when I'm a corporation, appealing to the parts of you that are selfish and self-centered and want to have fun all the time is the best way to sell you things, right? One's reduced to talking, I think, about general terms like being grown up, or a term that's rarely used here anymore. And see, and now I feel embarrassment because I'm going to sound like my grandfather or something. But the word citizen, the idea of being a citizen, it would be to understand your country's history and the things about it that are good and not so good, and how the system works, and taking the trouble to learn about candidates for political office, which means often reading stuff, which isn't fun. Sometimes it's boring. But when people don't do that, here's what happens. The candidates win who have the most money to buy television advertisements, because television advertisements are all most voters know about the candidates. Therefore, we get candidates who are beholden to large donors and become, in some ways, corrupt, which disgusts the voters and makes the voters even less interested in politics, less willing to read and do the work of citizenship. When I was a little boy, there was a class called citizenship. And here are certain things about America and America's history. Here's why it's important to vote. Here's why it's important not just to go in and vote for who the best-looking candidate is. Here's what's really interesting, and I don't know if you can translate this. Talking about this now, I feel ashamed, because my saying all this sounds to me like an older person saying this, like a person lecturing, which in American culture sets me up to be ridiculed. It would be very easy to make fun of what I'm saying. You know, it'd be very, very easy to make fun of what I'm saying, and I can hear in my head a voice making fun of this stuff as I'm saying it. And this is the kind of paradox, I think, of what it is to be a halfway intelligent American right now, and probably also a Western European, is that there are things we know are right and good and would be better for us to do. But constantly it's like, yeah, but you know, it's so much funnier and nicer to go do something else, and who cares, and it's all bullshit anyway. And, sorry. And for me personally, I don't know that it's really ever been all that different. I think probably American education used to be a little bit better and a little bit more difficult, and children had no choice but to realize that there were certain things that were hard and involved a certain amount of drudgery that were actually very satisfying at the end of it. But for the most part, I think in the U.S., people who've been doing, quote, serious stuff, which is harder and stranger, have always played to a much smaller audience. There's a difference, though, I think, between being mildly bored, but then there's another kind of boredom that I think you're talking about, which is reading. Reading requires sitting alone by yourself in a quiet room, and I have friends, intelligent friends, who don't like to read because it's not just bored. There's an almost dread that comes up, I think, here about having to be alone and having to be quiet, and you see that when you walk in. When you walk into most public spaces in America, it isn't quiet anymore. They pipe music through, and the music's easy to make fun of because it's usually really horrible music. But it seems significant that we don't want things to be quiet ever anymore. And to me, I don't know that I could defend it, but that seems to me to have something to do with when you feel like the purpose of your life is to gratify yourself and get things for yourself and go all the time. There's this other part of you that's the same part that can kind of is almost hungry for silence and quiet and thinking really hard about the same thing for maybe half an hour instead of 30 seconds, that doesn't get fed at all. And it makes itself felt in the body in a kind of dread in here. And I don't know whether that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think it's true that here in the U.S. every year the culture gets more and more hostile. And I don't mean hostile like angry, just it becomes more and more difficult to ask people to read or to look at a piece of art for an hour, or to listen to a piece of music that's complicated and that takes work to understand, because, well, there are a lot of reasons, but particularly now in computer and internet culture, everything is so fast, and the faster things go, the more we feed that part of ourselves, but don't feed the part of ourselves that likes quiet, that can live in quiet, that can live without any kind of stimulation. I don't know. Well, particularly if you have a remote control, see, when that happens, you go to a different channel. And if you don't like that channel, you go to a different channel. And one of the reasons I can't own a TV is I've started having this thing where I've become convinced there's something really good on another channel and that I'm missing it. And so instead of watching, I'm scanning anxiously back and forth for this thing that I think I want that I don't even know what it is. And so I don't know whether well, this is probably not a good thing to say on television, but I don't know whether a similar thing happens in Germany, but it's very stressful now. And what it is too much good stuff combined with my sick little head that thinks there's always something a little better on the next thing. And all you have to do, you don't have to get up now to change it. That was the problem. When it became easy, you just had to move your thumb and change it. That's when we were screwed.
So do you think it's...
90% of this is going to be cut out, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, okay. When I was young, or younger, I used to... There's a way in which we in America are comfortable, very comfortable. And I used to think that some of the political and social answers that I thought should be... Some of the political and social corrections that I thought should be brought about would happen when there was some sort of cataclysm or misfortune where we weren't as comfortable anymore. The fact that we now have clear evidence that the way we live and the relationships we have with various other countries are causing some people to hate us so much that they want to kill us, and may succeed in killing a great many of us, frightens me only because well, when I was growing up, one of the mythological periods for us growing up is the Great Depression, Weimar era, where the story goes, everyone pulled together. There were hard times and no one had enough, but everyone pulled together and everybody. It seems to me now that that the country's reaction to feeling frightened and insecure is to buy sports utility vehicles that are large and massive and tank-like and make individual people feel safer, but also get 4 miles to the gallon in a country where gasoline is probably 1/5 as expensive as it ought to be. There's a sanity in Europe about gasoline prices and fuel consumption that there isn't here yet, and yet are voting for people who are deciding to go over and very possibly kill hundreds of thousands of civilians in order to kill a few enemies, and none of which is important. But the fact that no one here is talking about the connection between how we live and what we drive, and the things that are happening, the speed with which it's become those bad people, those bad fanatics, they're evil. What they really hate is our freedom and our way of life, which is just hard to swallow, right? Like, who hates freedom? Yeah. People hate people, not freedom. I now don't know what's going to happen, and I am as an American as scared. Not since I was a little boy and I worried about the U.S. and the Soviet Union having an intercontinental. Not since that have I been this scared. And this is totally personally, but I'm more scared of us than I am of anybody else, and that's a bleak place to be. I'm not sure how I feel about. Well, you're going to use it if you want. I don't think this is an evil country. I don't think American people are evil. I think we've had it very easy materially for a long time, and we've gotten very little help in understanding things that are important besides being comfortable. And I don't think anybody knows how we will react if things get really hard here. And the fact that we're strong militarily and economically is a good thing, but it's also a frightening thing. To some of us as Americans. So
and what kind of, yes, which is already almost.
Now I probably will, well, luckily, yeah, not a lot of Americans will see this in Germany.
I mean, are there any means of rebellion?
Sure.
So, what would it be?
Well, there are people doing it all over the place. I don't know about people rappelling down buildings and getting tear gassed and stuff. The people I know who are rebelling meaningfully, don't buy a lot of stuff, and don't get their view of the world from television, and are willing to spend 4 or 5 hours researching an election rather than going by commercials. And the thing about it is that in America we think of rebellion as this very sexy thing, and that it involves action and force and looks good. And my guess is the forms of rebellion that will end up changing anything meaningfully here will be very quiet and very individual, and probably not all that interesting to look at from the outside. I'm now hoping for less interesting rather than more interesting. Violence is interesting, and horrible corruption and scandals and rattling sabers and talking about war and demonizing 1 billion people of a different faith in the world. Those are all interesting. Sitting in a chair and really thinking about what this means, and why the fact that what I drive might have something to do with how people in other parts of the world feel about me isn't interesting to anybody else. That was very close to the truth, but I don't think it's going to make much sense. And plus, yeah, it's a little. I mean, I'm a writer. I'm not a, I'm not a politician or a political thinker or whatever. Just a scared little American living in California.